no regrets, no confusion. There'll be no pollution. I'm so thankful I've decided to change my ways.
Welcome back to the Leaving Eden podcast. My name is Gabriel Hakohen. My BFF and co-host, cult expert, cult survivor Sadie Carpenter, is taking a week off this week. But don't worry, I am going to be joined by Eric Skwarczynski of the Preacher Boys podcast. We had a fantastic conversation about the new interview with Olivia Plath that was in Teen Vogue that came out last week. It's a great conversation. Hope that you guys like it. Before we get into that, the Leaving Eden podcast is the podcast that's mostly about my BFF and co-host, cult expert, cult survivor Sadie Carpenter's life in and escape from the Independent Fundamental Baptist cult, the cult in which she was raised. Obviously, that's not the topic today, but we talk about other things. We talk about this cult. We talk about other cults. We talk about religion. We talk about fundamentalism. We talk about the real and present threat that cults and cult ideologies pose to society as a whole, and it is our goal to promote freedom of mind, freedom of thought, and freedom of religion. So if you like our show, if you're a fan of our show, then I hope that you will consider subscribing to our Patreon, patreon.com/Leaving Eden podcast, where you get access to extended, uncensored, ad-free versions of most of our episodes. You also get the episodes a couple of days early, so if you want to go there and check that out, that's patreon.com/Leaving Eden podcast. You can also join our Facebook group and our subreddit. Both of those are called Eden Exodus. And I guess before I get into the conversation I had with Eric, then I'm going to thank the patrons. I gave it all to your patrons. Your names are I'm Not 1010, Kathleen Moncrief, Melissa Manown, Melora King, and Todd Dale on behalf of his lovely deconstructorinix of a spouse, Madeline Antrim. Thank you guys so much for subscribing to our I Gave It All tier. Our Faith Promise Missions patrons, your names are Alex P., Allie Allen, Autumn of Our Discontent, Brittany, Chrissa Walker, Dora J., Eleanor Donahue, Hannah Ross, Hope Norum, Horton Here's a Shane, Janine Collin, Jana Connor, Jen Kaharski, Jessica Tambo, Jonna, Junie B. Jones, and the B stands for Bible Humper. Humper, Humpr. Humper. Kat Henwood, Kay Turwee, Kristen Marie, Learned Vixen, Linda Morgan, Madeline Antrim, Madeline Cusick, Maddie the Seventh Day Badventist, Marlena Stuve, Mary Martin, Megan Arendt, Morgan, Rob the Methodist, Stephanie Johnson, Steve and Amy, Susie, Tara McNamara, and Wes the Cowboy. Thank you guys so much for subscribing to our Patreon at the Faith Promise Missions and I Gave It All tiers. This is the wonderful conversation that I had with Eric. We are here. I am joined in the podcast virtual studio, the Leaving Eden virtual studio, I guess, by the one, the only Eric Skwarczynski. You know him from Preacher Boys podcast. He was also in Let Us Pray, a Ministry of Scandals. How are you doing today, Eric?
Doing really well. Glad to be in your virtual studio. I love what you've done with the place.
Thank you. It looks just like the inside of my bedroom and also the inside of wherever it is that you're recording.
Yeah, it looks like the inside of my bedroom as well. So very cool.
So Eric has kindly agreed to come on and talk about the new developments. Olivia Plath from Welcome to Plathville has recently done an interview, did an article in Teen Vogue talking about her journey out of Christian fundamentalism. Also, this was kind of the theme of a lot of the latest season of Welcome to Plathville, which was an interesting watch for sure. And Eric has agreed to come on and talk to us about that. So where do you want to start, Eric?
First and foremost, I was just blown away that the subject of deconstruction is getting talked about in Teen Vogue. Like, I thought that was really, really cool that the cultural conversation has become so broad to where, I mean, even for me in 2014, 15, 16 onward, like, deconstruction was not a word I heard. Like, I would always say, I'm kicking away at the floorboards. I'm checking this out. I'm seeing what I actually believe. And so, like, the fact that now there's vocabulary for that process and that it's become so mainstream that it's being talked about in major publications is fantastic. And also, I'm not an avid reader of Teen Vogue, surprised I'm not the main demographic, but I thought it was a really fantastic article. And so I just want to start there with the fact that I'm happy the conversation's happening, and I'm happy that it's in a publication that's not, Christianity Today, or something that's going to be more niche down, even a more liberal version of it. Like it's specifically something that is accessible to everybody. I think that's really cool.
Yeah, I'm with you there, because when I first heard about the Welcome to Plathville, I just assumed that Plathville was dollar store Duggars.
Yep,
and they're
exactly.
not.
That's what I thought too.
My impression, and Sadie and I have done episodes about Welcome to Plathville before. My thought about it being, at first I thought it was going to just be dollar store Duggars, but then I watched the show and I'm like, oh, this isn't just a show about, hey, we went and hung out with Dolly Parton and we sang for her and it was really awkward.
Sure.
And nothing bad ever happens in Duggarville. We're the perfect family and everything is perfect and everything is fine and nothing bad has ever happened to anybody in here ever. For any reason whatsoever, and if it does, then it's God testing you. And like, this is not that show. It's a show about family dynamics. It's a show about relationships between different people. Which I'm a reality TV fan. I know, Eric, you're a reality TV fan. You're a Real Housewives fan, as am I.
I'm not anywhere near your level of Housewives fan. I will watch it out of the corner as my wife watches it. I enjoy, the Beverly Hills and Orange County and seeing California represented in all its insanity, as a former Californian myself. But I am way down the rabbit hole on like 90 Day Fiance. Like that's my bread and butter. God. Like that's my go-to. And Welcome to Plathville now has really shifted into gear for me. As well as some of these polygamy shows, Seeking Sister Wives. Like, yeah, I'm into the trash TV for sure.
Oh yeah, who isn't? I mean, my thought was always that, oh well, there's people in here that don't exactly want to go along with whatever the orthodoxy of, and Olivia was always one of those people. And always, it seemed to me, when I would go online and hear people talk about it and see people talk about it, people were always so black and white on Olivia.
Yeah.
It was either you love Olivia or Olivia is tearing the family apart. She's a liar. She's a harlot. She's the worst. She's the, and it's good to see, I don't know, like you were saying, the word deconstruction being used as like a mainstream word that people are talking about now.
Well, it's one of the things, like you mentioned, the dollar store Duggar. I just did an episode on the article, kind of breaking it down. And, I mentioned all these shows and I mentioned like, oh, I love trash TV. But what really fascinated me about the Plathville series is that it's decidedly very different than trash TV. Like the Duggars was trash TV for conservative fundamentalists, where we want to see the storybook version of ourselves put up on the big screen. And then you have like the 90 Day Fiancés and the Love is, the Love is Blind and all those types of shows, which is, but it's all trash TV. It's not things of substance, and then as I was sitting there like watching a movie on my phone and I'd look up as my wife's watching an episode, all of a sudden I'm hearing conversations that are actually pretty heavy and deep, and it's not played out in a way that's hyper dramatized. Like it feels like you're sitting there having the conversations that, for myself, I was having at the time, like with people about deconstruction. It was a very fascinating thing. And it quickly elevated that show for me to go, okay, we're actually talking about things that really matter. And this is some heavy stuff to be talking about on national television.
And my thoughts were exactly the same. And also I have the same sort of thoughts about Real Housewives of Salt Lake City. That's kind of one of the reasons why I gravitated to that franchise of Real Housewives so much. Because I started watching it at many years after, I started doing the pod with Sadie. Let's get into like some of the stuff that Olivia talks about in this interview that she did with Teen Vogue. One of the things that I'm struck by was she talked about how her upbringing, she was, Christian. I don't want to say nominally Christian because her family was definitely a church every Sunday kind of family, it seems. But then they started going to a much more conservative and much more fundamentalist church. And the restrictions on what they were allowed to wear, how they were allowed to act, what they were allowed to do became more and more and more a part of their daily lives. And one thing that I've heard Sadie talk about and other people talk about is that parents who came to this after they'd had their kids don't have the same experiences and don't understand that it can be as hard for kids because their kids are being raised in it while they had normal upbringings and they can sort of ask those questions themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And I definitely agree with that. I've heard Sadie mention that before on the show. And, that was my experience, is that my parents, my dad grew up nominally Catholic. My mom grew up pretty strict Baptist. I would say she grew up pretty close to Independent Baptist, although it was a different, similar Baptist denomination. But both of them, in many ways, kind of chose the IFB. I would say my mom kind of never really fully left, but my dad specifically really picked it. And for both of them, when I talk about my experience growing up in the church that we went to, my experience in the church was quite different than theirs. So, like, the more extreme preaching I heard at youth conferences and in youth groups, like stuff that maybe they didn't necessarily hear. And, and I've seen that experience echoed by other people too, who, where their parents can remember a time before the church, but the kids can't. Like, it's a completely different deconstruction process, because like you're not just stepping back into normal life, quote unquote. Like, you're kind of literally have to figuring out like what normal life is and then adjust to it. And that's a really weird process to be on. And it's one where, I mentioned my episode about this, like I resonate with both Ethan's side, where it's like that, like more conservative than Olivia's early childhood. But I also resonate with the fact that, I'm in between those two. Like I resonate with things Ethan says. I resonate with things Olivia says, because I've lived on both sides of that spectrum in many different ways.
Yeah, and there's a quote in here. Let me see if I can find it from Olivia's mother, because like that's the other thing that I'm thinking, and I've heard you say this, I've heard Sadie say this a bunch of times, is that the parents don't get the youth group and they don't get the extreme purity culture teachings that their kids are getting. Here's a quote from here where she says basically, we went to a Christian church, and she says, adding that they quote, "If not wearing tank tops was a rule in her household, she was not aware, but said that pressure from the church community may have contributed to styles of dress. My husband and I failed to understand just how much peer pressure our children were under from those opinionated people, and we deeply regret that." But this is a very interesting way that she says this is very similar to something that I talked about with Sadie's dad at one point. But Meg says that fundamentalism is often used disparagingly, warranting a larger conversation around the word, what that word means for her family. And I remember having a conversation with Sadie's dad about it, and he said, well, I always felt like fundamentalism in like the old school way was like, well, this is what Christians believe X, Y, Z, but then all of the other things got added on top of it. And that seems to be like, that's what she's referencing here.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, first, I would probably say I don't doubt that her mom was unaware of some of the extreme pressure within the church, just based on, like I said, my experience, what you mentioned, Sadie, saying about like getting the more harsh versions of it. It's very possible that, when you're a kid in these environments and your parents place you in a position where they give you an external authority figure, you're assuming everything that authority figure says is pre-greenlit by your parents. So like, it just doesn't come up where you go, hey, they said this, it was weird. Like, you kind of assume they already know that. And, to put some responsibility on the parents, they probably should know what people are teaching their kids. So first, I don't dispute, like, that probably was her experience, finding out about this stuff later. But on the other side of this as well, I think when it comes into the conversation about like what fundamentalism means, I think you see that in the conversations in Welcome to Plathville, where you have an Ethan type figure who I think in many ways is trying to maintain some of the, I would say, traditional fundamentalism, some of the things that he views as important, but also his guideposts have kind of shifted a little bit. So, and then you see Kim, who's, what's so clear at one point is now not so clear. And then you see the dad, who has a different level of what this looks like. And all of them are coming from a place of, this is what we believe God's telling us to do in whatever given situation. But that's kind of where all these issues arise from, is like, the Bible is not as clear as most quote unquote fundamentalists want to say. Like, you can walk away and one person can say, well, it's very clearly condemns drinking. And another person can walk away saying, well, in this passage, God prescribes drinking to somebody. Like it's just when you start getting into that black and white mentality, like you start setting yourself up for failure and fractures and splinters among your own very hardcore denomination.
But it does say different things at different times to different people. And that's kind of like, but if you take every biblical commandment as, yes, this is a thing that God intended for me, anything that God has ever told to anybody ever is something that he was also telling to me.
Right.
That's kind of a recipe for insanity.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I had Dr. Stephen Hassan on, who's a cult expert recently, and he's also he's a member of a Jewish synagogue, and he talks about the experience of practicing the Jewish faith, and I asked a lot of questions about that, and he even brought up the method of eisegesis versus exegesis, like reading your preconceived notion into the text versus reading what the text is saying in context, and that's that level, like that basic elementary level of literacy just doesn't exist with most evangelicals of any branch. And I would say even outside of evangelicals, like most people's media literacy is shockingly bad, but people tend to go into text with their system and then say, what do these verses say that confirms my bias toward fill in the blank belief, whether we're talking about end times, whether we're talking about gender issues, or fill in the blank with the broad spectrum of things people fight about.
Oh yeah, I totally agree with that. I also think that it's very interesting, and I think that I want to thank you also for doing such a good job of talking about this when you were on Let Us Pray, but specifically talking about how the biblical literalism is such an important part of the way that all of this works.
Yeah, it's an important piece. And I think one of the things that, I don't know if it made it in the documentary, but it's one of the things that I said in the filming that I remember was, at the end of the day, we can sit and debate as to whether all of these beliefs are true. And again, fill in those beliefs with whatever beliefs you want to talk about. But ultimately, whether or not they're true is irrelevant if people believe that they're true. Like, if you believe something is true, it's going to affect the way that you interact with everything else in your life. And so I think sometimes people get caught up on, oh, it's really silly that evangelicals believe fill in the blank, instead of addressing the fact that they do believe that. So how does that practically affect the way that they're voting, the way that they're making decisions about education, the way that they make decisions about other people's rights? Like, that's a much bigger conversation. And in their mind, it is from a literal interpretation of the literal words of God. And when you're starting in that position, any debate is going to be relatively fruitless initially, because you're combating a belief system that's coming directly from the Lord himself, in their eyes, at least.
Yeah. And that kind of ties back to this article where Olivia was essentially regarded as somebody who was brainwashing other family members, trying to sort of drag them out of this and brainwashing them away from what was their true calling, which was this Christian life, which was this strict adherence to this moral code of conduct. Yeah, so one of the other big takeaways that I had from here was one of the big catalysts for Olivia getting out was when she was talking about the structural, it says here that she was talking about structural inequities. She was talking about the George Floyd murder, racism, COVID-19 pandemic. Those sorts of things were things that were a problem for her with the belief system that she was in.
Mm-hmm.
Mirrors what I've heard from so many other people who around that same time were getting out of similar branches of fundamentalist religious groups.
Yeah, I actually recently interviewed Dr. Laura Anderson, who writes a lot about religious trauma. And she actually just came on my show and talked about the links between political, like election cycles, and religious trauma. And it's a really interesting topic, but it's also interesting talking to her because it seems like there's this cycle almost every 4 years where people are seeing sides of their faith communities that they've never seen before, or they're seeing things that were always, a light hum become a really loud noise. You know, I've been saying lately, and I feel proud of this saying, but it's kind of when the dog whistles become bullhorns, where the things that were kind of an undercurrent in the church become front and center. And for me, it was the 2016, 2017 realm that really accelerated me questioning evangelicalism as a whole, as I saw the Donald Trump, phenomenon take place. And I had to start asking myself questions as an evangelical as to why are evangelicals overwhelmingly supporting this figure? And the truth was, it wasn't that he didn't represent evangelical values. It's that he was the personification of evangelical values. It was just really scary to look at when it was dialed to 11. And I think reading Olivia's article, I resonated in a big way when she mentions 2020. And I'm seeing a new wave of people that are referencing 2020 and the conversations that were being had, yes, about race. That was a major one, but also conversations from churches about wild conspiracy theories and things that were, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Like it's just really fascinating to see like that kind of constant churning of people going like, oh, I didn't realize how nuts this was. And it's bizarre that the boogeymen change so rapidly. Like I think about 2016, 2017, and the whole fight within so much of this was, it was pro-Israel, pro this, pro that, loving Jews, all of that kind of language was so strong. And then now there's so much of this that the church is pushing that's rooted in anti-Semitism. So like the boogeyman has almost done like a complete 180, but it's all the same stuff of us versus them. Our church is the last stand of this. It's really bizarre, but it's exactly the same thing. It's just different coat of paint.
I was having a conversation with a friend who is not, I guess I haven't asked this friend if I can say their name, so I'm not going to say their name on the show. But I was having a conversation with a friend, and they were telling me about how after the video from the George Floyd murder came out, and they were talking to their dad, who's very conservative about what happened there. And the dad watched the video, and the dad said, I can't believe that they would do that to that man. That what on earth could that man have done to deserve that? Like, this is clearly murder. This is clearly awful. Like, something must be done. That officer really needs to go to jail. And then like 3 days later, after he either got whatever messaging it was that he was getting from, where he was consuming his news from, or where he was in church, 3 days later, well, they don't even know if he died from choking. They thought that he could have had drugs in his system, or he was a dangerous guy and everyone hated it. Like, and it's just like, you go from like, clearly I can see this in front of my eyes that this is wrong. And then you get the levels and levels and levels and levels of like, oh, well, this is what we need from you. We need you to support this thing because it's for our movement.
Yeah. I mean, if I can be the really annoying guy for a second, just for 1 second, I just watched The Matrix for the first time, like 4 days ago.
I thought you were a film guy.
I am.
I thought you were a movie guy.
I am, but I also am a former fundamentalist who's catching up. Okay. There's a lot of movies to watch. But I was saving The Matrix, just like you saved Revelation. I was saving The Matrix for the right time. And they re-released it in theaters for, I believe its anniversary, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago. And so I was like, well, now's the right time. I'm going to go see it on the big screen, which it was fantastic. And as I was watching, I was like, I understand why everybody who's seen this is so annoying about it with all the constant references, because it's really good. But there was one line in that movie specifically that I think really sums up the fundamentalist experience and the experience of leaving. And it's the moment where Neo is unplugged from the Matrix, and he's sitting there talking to Morpheus, and he says, "Why do my eyes hurt?" And Morpheus says, "It's because you've never used them before." And what you just described explains fundamentalism in that way. you are seeing things constantly. You are seeing entire constructs, you're seeing entire experiences, entire narratives, but you're not seeing it through your own eyes, because your own eyes would tell you pretty clearly what's right and what's wrong. You're informed by not to sound like Andrew Tate, the matrix around you, whether that's your church, your political, news channel, your fill in the blank. It tells you what to see. And I think the process of deconstruction, you see this in Olivia's story, you see this in my story, Sadie's story, everyone who's experienced unplugging from fundamentalism, it is a painful thing to all of a sudden have to use your eyes and questioning, what can I trust? What can't I? Because the people who told me, hey, feel this way about the George Floyd case, feel this way about COVID, feel this way about Trump, and blah, 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 blah. Like, those people are gone. And so you have to start determining what's actually real. And that's a really scary process. And, my last matrix analogy for today, that's why you get the guys like Cypher that go, just plug me back in. I know this stake isn't real, but, I realize after all this time, it just doesn't matter to me. Plug me back in. And I think that's kind of the journey of fundamentalists, is the ones that want to be unplugged, the ones that don't, but know that the freedom of being unplugged is still brutally painful.
Wait till you get to the part where you find out about that movie being a trans allegory.
Oh, I already knew that. I knew that sitting down.
Oh, you already knew that? Okay.
I'm enough of a movie buff. I actually knew all of that. I've read the interviews about it. Like, I have a weird thing where people will say, hey, do you know so-and-so? I'll be like, oh yeah, they're in this movie and this. They're like, have you seen it? No, I just know that for some reason. But I did know it was a trans allegory, which is hysterical to me because of all the alpha red pill brain that love it. And then watching it, I'm like, well, it's kind of crystal clear in many ways. But then, I also think The Matrix, the reason it's so significant culturally is because, again, you can sit down and it's such a beautiful allegory that can be applied to so many things that, like, a deconstructionist could watch it and view it one way, and Andrew Tate can watch it one way. You can view it from a million different perspectives. And I think that's a powerful storytelling device if you can apply it to so many different situations. But yeah, the trans allegory stuff is like crystal clear. Knowing that going in and sitting down, you're like, oh yeah, I see that all over this, all over this movie.
Olivia talks about how COVID was also and the pandemic was also a big catalyst for her, fast tracking her deconstruction. And that was also something that I've heard from a lot of people.
Yep.
One of the things I was thinking about with this is that COVID was such a wild time in history because in some ways we were more separated from each other than we'd ever been before.
Yeah.
Quarantine, stay inside, all that. In other ways, we were more connected to each other than we'd ever been before because everybody was online. Everybody was talking to everybody else online all the time, all day. Especially if you were somebody like me who was, remember, I made lifelong or people who I hope are going to be lifelong friends during that period of time and got perspectives about the world that I never thought that I would get before, just because I was bored and just because I was in my house and I had nothing to do other than to talk to people. I think that can be a huge catalyst towards a lot of people's deconstruction because on one hand, I've heard it say from people, we're supposed to be protecting people who have less because that's what we do because we're the church. But at the same time, they're like, well, the government wants to shut down the church because they don't want our message to get out there. And there was just that kind of disconnect that you were seeing from people.
Yeah. Yeah. I think for me, I resonate a lot with that too. Like the period of being locked in your house and the period of contemplation is going to fast forward. I mean, even for me, like I was largely deconstructed by the time COVID hit, but it helped fast track it and helped, being online, communicating with like-minded people and also seeing the conversations from people who were all of a sudden missing a Sunday or a Wednesday for a couple weeks and realizing like, hey, my week's not worse than it was. In fact, in many ways, life is a lot better not going there. It was a time that just radically changed everybody's perspective. And it also, I think, exposed like the insanity of some of the, like you mentioned, those beliefs that like, hey, this is a coup to shut down churches, or this is all down those rabbit holes that people, I think, who are on the fringe didn't know there was that like fear of government and the fear of, all these external factors, and fear of science, was really a big piece in the forefront. I actually just interviewed Scott Coley, who wrote a fantastic book talking about propaganda. And he talked about in the book, he lists out a couple different pieces, but one of the chapters is on creationism. And so when I sat down with him, I was like, I get talking about, racial issues, gender hierarchies, like some of those things when it comes to evangelical propaganda. But next to all of them, creationism seems fairly tame. And he said when he was putting the book together, he's like, I would never have thought to add a chapter on creationism until COVID. And he said, when I saw the anti-intellectual inclination of evangelicals during that period and started tracing it back, he's like, there's no clearer starting point for anti-intellectualism in evangelical circles than the creation, science industry. And so I think, again, for even someone like him who's studied it for a long time, I think, again, seeing it plastered in the way it was across social media and seeing the more insane, pastors ripping up, papers from the government in the pulpit and things like that, I think it really showed people like, oh, there is like a real streak of anti-intellectualism and just conspiracy theory that is flooding these places. Again, even if you weren't fully aware of what you felt at the time about any of these issues, there was clearly something there that was deeper than, how do we combat this? It was like, it was rooted in a lot of anti-intellectualism and a lot of like hardcore conspiracy theories of they are doing this to attack the church, which that's a really huge multinational conspiracy that a lot of people would have to be in on to make it work.
That's the conspiracy that Alberto Rivera wrote about. It's the conspiracy that Mike Warnke wrote about, John Todd, all those grifters, kind of, that was their whole thing. When I was growing up as a very growing up in Portland, Oregon, which was the
conservative Mecca, Portland, Oregon.
Yeah, the conservative Mecca. No, the liberal bastion of Portland, Oregon. I always, and with my family having the politics that we had, it always felt like we would talk about, oh, well, the creationists believe this, and we would use like the video of the guy like tearing up the picture of the ape on the from the church pulpit and say, look, this is what the other guys believe. Aren't we so smart for being better than them? I mean, I remember my dad had a ruby red Toyota Prius with a Dissent is Patriotic bumper sticker on the back of it, or some pretentious like that.
Yeah.
I love you, Dad. But when George Bush was the president, that's part of the other sense that I get from it, is that can be such a alienating thing if you feel like you've got to be better than everybody else.
Right.
If you grew up like me, or if you grew up like very Christian,
no,
that you've got to feel like you've got to be better than everybody else.
It's your religion is doing the opposite of what everybody else is doing. Like it's reactionary beliefs. So it's not, I mean, you saw it play out in COVID. I mean, and you saw this on both sides in COVID, where initially when all of this happened, and I don't want to go too deep down the COVID rabbit hole because someone will cancel me somewhere. But it's when it initially happened, and Trump wanted to put out a vaccine near the end, or at least talked about it, because he wanted to be the first and the best at everything. You had people on the left who were online critiquing like, oh, you can't rush this out. And then later on, when, it's a Biden saying it, you have those same people on Facebook saying, oh, that's fantastic, he's doing this. And then you had the Trump people who were supportive of the vaccine when Trump said it, now turning against it. And it's like, if you're making your decision about this issue based on which talking head is saying it, like, that's probably a major issue. Like, I don't really care which political talking head is saying this. Like, what are the scientists saying? And I think you saw like kind of the culty reactionary groups kind of lashing out at each other. And then you had the people that weren't on those fringes. I think like the me or the you or the average American is going, okay, but what is science actually saying? Like, not what is party or religion saying about this, because they don't know about this. Like, what do the experts say? And again, I think people that were staring at the fringe, that was really brought front and center. Like, they were just kind of panicked, like, oh, these are the people that are making the decisions in my life, both spiritually and politically. We're in big trouble.
It's like, oh, conservatives are the new punk. Like we're the counterculture. Like,
bro, I just heard someone literally say, the comedian Andrew Schultz just said on his show, he was like, country. It was so stupid sounding. He was like, country is the new rap, because rap was all about, fighting the status quo and fighting he's like, and now if you like country, you're like on the outside, and I was like, bro, come on. What are you talking about, dude? Rap is rap. Country is country,
I mean, they have you heard Jelly Roll?
I have heard Jelly Roll. Yes. He's a talented dude.
He looks like Post Malone.
He does look a little bit like Post Malone. I never put those two together.
He used to be a drug dealer, and now he's a country singer. I listened to his album. His album's pretty good. Very overtly Christian.
Yeah, the dude's really talented, though.
Really talented, but also kind of like rap influence on his music. Solid stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, if you ask me. Let's go to break, and then we'll come back, and we'll actually dive more into this article. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds great.
Hey, Sadie here. If this is your first time listening to the Leaving Eden podcast, make sure you go back and check out episode 57. It's a primer episode for new listeners. That episode tells my personal story and gives you all the terms and information that you'll need to know going forward. Also, check out our cult true crime series, The First Family of Fundamentalism, so that you can get the whole cult story. If you like our show, you can support us by joining our Patreon, where we have extended and uncensored episodes as well as other bonus content available. You can also join in the discussion in our Facebook group. That group is called Eden Exodus. Tell a friend, tell a family member, tell your worst enemy. The Leaving Eden podcast is a fully independent podcast, and we really appreciate your support. Now, back to the show.
We are back from our break. We were talking about this Teen Vogue article written by Brittany McNamara about Olivia Plath's deconstruction. Olivia's family wasn't IBLP.
Right.
But they came up sort of like similar to the IBLP.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and again, there's not many specifics, and I always question, like, I always question articles like this. Is it the journalist isn't as familiar with these circles, or is it that maybe they truly were super just fringe, the church that Olivia was in? Because the names mentioned, like, they grew up very adjacent to IBLP and the teaching there. But then later it mentions that she meets Ethan, which I did not know this, that she met Ethan at a Michael and Debbie Pearl conference. I didn't know that at all. And I was like, well, she was definitely deeper down the rabbit hole. Because some people say, oh, I grew up fundamentalist. It just means they went to like an evangelical church with like a little bit of weird purity culture stuff. But I'm like, you were deep down the fundamentalist rabbit hole if a Michael and Debbie Pearl, because they're fairly fringe. Like, you have to be in a fundamentalist circle to have been linked to them at all.
I've read To Train Up a Child. I've read Created to Be His Helpmeet.
Beautiful books, important books.
Both of those books were just books that, like, after reading them was like get me a hose and a bottle of bleach and let me pour that into my ears. Like, right. That was my reaction to that. No, but I was talking to Chad Harris recently. I don't know if that episode is going to come out before this one or after this one, but I had a conversation with Chad Harris where he was talking about going on deputation when he was being a missionary.
Right.
And some churches were like good with the IBLP, and some churches they had to like keep quiet that they were IBLP involved. I think it's so interesting here that she talks about not being, but like clearly the Plaths were in some ways IBLP involved.
Yeah.
And that kind of cross-pollination would happen.
Right. And that's what I mean is like, I don't know if it's just like they don't name the specific group or subsect because it's not something that and not, to no fault of their own, but it's something that a journalist just wouldn't know unless it was disclosed, or if it's something where they truly like, maybe just Olivia didn't know exactly what subsect, but I'd be very curious, like, to talk to her more specifically about some of the big influences, because I feel like there's probably a lot of names she would reference being influences if they were going to conferences and things that would cross over into the IFB world. I feel like she was more than, because when I first started watching Welcome to Plathville, I thought like maybe loosely adjacent, but it felt less so than the Duggars. But it almost feels more than the Duggars based on the descriptors. So yeah, I'd just be fascinated, like, to be able to ask some like inside baseball questions about some of that specifically.
When I read Jill's book, the thing that made them kind of the X factor was that they weren't as clean cut as all of the other IBLP families.
Yeah, they were the cool homeschoolers.
You know, their kids were less well behaved, and their
Right.
you know, maybe they weren't as clean, they didn't look as nice as the other IBLP families. Very much, I always felt like the Plaths were more polished than the Duggars were when I was watching the show.
Yeah.
It's also kind of creepier in that regard. But like, you don't get to a Michael and Debbie Pearl conference
Right.
unless you're like,
You're down the rabbit hole. Yeah.
if she went to some like a Michael and Debbie Pearl conference and she wasn't that deep into it, and she was just like, oh, it was just a church conference that we went to about like child raising, or like about being a good wife or something like that, or it was like a marriage conference, this is where you're going to meet other like young men who are the right kind of Christian.
Right.
Like, I don't know if you would necessarily remember specifically that it was Michael and Debbie Pearl.
Right. Exactly.
That's so interesting. Though we've had that experience so many times. I would want to ask her like how many chick tracks, like which chick track was her favorite, or if she had the chick comics.
Yeah. I'd be curious. Yeah.
But so she meets Ethan at this conference, and the Plathville essentially starts with her marriage to Ethan.
Right.
And saying like, this is what the show is going to be about. I don't want to say that like, what's the show going to do now that they're not married to each other anymore? Is it still going to follow her? And is it still going to be like, oh, what's Olivia up to? Because I feel like the central tension of the show was, what do Ethan and Olivia want to do? What do Micah and Mariah want to do? And then what do Kim and Barry want to do?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know narratively how that works, but I will say for me, my interest in the show drastically drops without her presence, because she was kind of the anchor for me to be interested in the show, because I saw a lot of reflection of like myself, maybe especially like 2 years ago, me like reflect in the conversations being held. And I feel like I would love to see her journey now, kind of unpacking that stuff. But yeah, for what the show is, her being outside of Plathville, for lack of a better word, in that orbit would kind of like, it would be very much like her own side quest in conjunction to the show. But I'd be, you know, if they gave her her own kind of spinoff or something about like kind of counting on for Plathville, you know, like I'd be down for that. But I think that tension was what made the show interesting and relatable in a lot of ways, versus the Duggars, where it was like, I mentioned the episode I did in the Duggars, when I watched it, it was familiar, but it was familiar to like a decade ago me versus me now.
Olivia never says in this article, she never says, oh, I'm atheist now.
Yeah. No, she's again, I think she sounds very similar to where I feel and where I was in the same point in the process, which was, it feels like it's a lot of exploring the gray, not being black and white. She used a word, like I said, untethered a lot when I came out publicly about the deconstruction. But she used the phrase, let me find it. Scrolling really quick. She used a phrase that was very similar. Yeah, but she used the verbiage that a world filled with nuance. There's no predestined story. She gives the elephant analogy at the end, but she talked a lot about just curiosity being the theme of her life, that faith doesn't look one way, that spirituality doesn't look one way. And I think that that's kind of where I think most people are I think the narrative of there being like people leave and they just become hardcore atheists is like kind of a stretch. I feel like most people that leave that I talk to generally fall into that realm of like, I'm sure there's something, I know that there's something beautiful beyond this life. I don't know what it looks like. And I felt like that's kind of what she said at the end was, you know, I don't know what it looks like. I don't know what it'll ever look like, but life just has to be lived to find out, you know? And I love that curiosity is the theme of my life. I think is a really interesting way to say it. And if I may, I feel like I just rambled, but I'm going to ramble just for a second more. I think this is my biggest issue with kind of the conversations around deconstruction. And again, this is one of those things I see happen in both sides of the conversation, from people that are critiquing deconstruction to people that are experiencing deconstruction and going through that process. When you say deconstruction or you say disentangling, the words themselves indicate that there's an endpoint. Like, eventually I'll be disentangled. Eventually I've deconstructed. The truth is, you're always deconstructing. Like, the process of deconstructing is the process of learning how to receive information, process the information, and apply the information that is helpful to your life. And so at the point you say, I'm done with that process, is when you become a fundamentalist, where you say, okay, now I have all the answers. No matter what information comes my way, this is what I believe. And I think the most beautiful way to experience life is to constantly be receiving new information, constantly applying new information that is right versus what the information was you held before, and just learning the process of thinking. And that process is never done. And I think that's why when you say disentangling, deconstruction, down the line with whatever analogy you want to say, I think you have to give yourself an opening to say, my journey of figuring things out is never done. Like, that process is a life process. And I was very relieved in many ways to see Olivia take that approach at the end of the article versus just saying that was all kooky nonsense. And now I'm just doing what I do. You know, like it wasn't that reactionary kind of living that I was describing earlier. Like, it's thoughtful, it's contemplative, it's a little bit of navel gazing without just letting the wind carry you wherever it takes you. Like, it's a healthy perspective, I think.
Did you watch the Paul and Morgan Girl Defined video where there was the 24 hours with Girl Defined?
I watched bits and pieces of it, and then I watched I listened to your guys' episode, and then I watched bits and pieces through the Fundy Fridays video. So I kind of watched it backwards in pieces through Funny Fridays and through your guys' conversation. Are you talking about the one right before the husband came out and said he was an atheist?
Yeah, that one. Because you can see in that one where, you know, Bethany starts talking about, well, we're trying to figure out what exactly it is that we believe. We maybe believe some things differently than we did back then. And then you can see that, like, the gears are turning where Paul just puts up he's just like you can see like alarm signals are going off in his brain, and he's just like,
you're thinking,
stop. And the reason why I thought of this was because I listened to your episode with Stephen Hassan, and Paul used a phrase that I think either you or Stephen used in the episode, where he said, well, don't be so open-minded that your brain falls out. I'm like, but he said that, and I'm like, he said that in the video, and then I heard you say that, or either, I can't remember whether it was you who said that or Stephen who said that, but talking about just like these thought-stopping cliches where it's like, don't think too much. If you think too much, then bad things are going to happen to you. And it really felt like that to me, because whenever you start talking about deconstruction, it's almost like the 5 stages of grief if you're talking about it with somebody who is that kind of Christian, because you can see that there's like what are the 5 stages of grief? There's the denial, there's the anger, there's the bargaining, there's the guilt, and there's the acceptance.
Drinking. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. That's one of the.
There's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance.
Yeah, and you can kind of see that where whenever somebody starts talking about deconstructing, being like, maybe I don't believe these things as strongly as I did before, they can see, they're like, I know where this train is headed. You're absolutely no, we got to stop this nonsense now.
Right.
And you sometimes see that reaction from people where even if you, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why when you see fundamentalist pastors try to cancel each other over very minute theological differences, like, oh, I've been rereading this passage and I think this means something slightly different than we thought it meant, but it's something, not that like meaningful, that not that like earth shaking. And then they're like, wait, you think a different thing than you thought yesterday? I know where this train is headed.
Right. Yeah.
Like,
yeah, it's the fear of the slippery slope, but again, I fear the slippery slope too if you're making your decisions without thought. If you're living in a reactionary way, that's dangerous. If you're changing a position because you have an intentionality and a thoughtfulness behind it, that's not a bad thing at all. I don't want somebody to leave the church because they didn't think about it and they just got pissed off one day and left. Just like I don't want someone to join the church because they had a really emotional experience visiting. Like, take the time to set emotion aside in many ways and look at it logically and objectively. Because the old sales, training statement is true, and I used to work with an auto group and they always said that, is that people buy with emotion and justify with logic. And I think that applies in worldviews too. People emotionally pick a position and then work backwards to justify it, whether that's joining a religious group or leaving a religious group. And I think the people that are the most even-headed are the people that are deconstructing thoughtfully, whether they, leave the church entirely or not. Like, I'd much rather see people use their brain instead of making a decision just purely because the vibes feel better here right now in this moment, and that's certainly a factor. Like, don't discount emotions completely, because if you're miserable, that's probably a sign of something bad. But to just do the opposite of one thing you don't like is not going to lead you anywhere except the opposite position, which many times it's another side of the same coin. So I don't know if that makes sense, but it's something that really gets under my skin, where I see people get panicked that somebody said, hey, I've been reading my Bible and came to a different position, or I've been studying this science and came to a different position, or I've been listening to these things and come to, like, we should encourage that. And an organization that's not encouraging you to do that, or a belief system that's not encouraging you to do that, or friends that aren't encouraging you to do that, are not really there for your best interest. They're there to make you stay just like them, which is the very definition of a cult. But again, that's just a quick hobby horse I want to jump on. But I didn't throw in a Matrix analogy, so hopefully it wasn't too ranty.
Well, one of the things I do appreciate about what Olivia is saying in here is that she's kind of like, I don't know what I believe.
Yeah.
I don't know what I believe. And that's one of the biggest things that people have to learn, because, say what you will about fundamentalism, they do have a worldview that is very internally consistent, where you can ascribe to a set of beliefs and say, okay, well, this is what I believe, and they figure out a way to make all of the puzzle pieces work. And the hardest thing for so many people is to leave that security behind and leave behind knowing, I know XYZ thing is true. That thing has always been true, and that thing is grounded in stone.
Yeah. Yeah, we crave certainty as human beings, and fundamentalism offers that on a silver platter to say, look at the conversation with Ethan and Olivia, to bring it back to them. That conversation is, I described it somewhere. I don't know if it was in an article I wrote about it or in the episode I did, but you have the unstoppable force of the questioning deconstructioner of Olivia, and you have the immovable object of fundamentalist rigidity in Ethan. And those two are not going to make it when one person is continuing to question the status quo and one is fighting tooth and nail to maintain it. Ethan, in one of the conversations they had, was like, I wanted a wife that was going to have my children, and you don't make home cooked meals for me. It was really crazy. I was like, you're saying the quiet stuff out loud there, buddy.
I mean, but that's what they promised him all his life.
Right.
Is like, if you do XYZ thing and you be an upstanding, God-fearing man, then you will be blessed with a godly wife who will do XYZ thing for you, you know.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, they met at a Michael and Debbie Pearl conference.
Right. Yeah. But that's where I have a lot of sympathy for both in that conversation, is that, again, Ethan was programmed to want that. And I think he did. There's a sense of, you know, and I definitely am team Olivia in these conversations. Don't get me wrong. Because I think ultimately he's still responsible for his belief systems now and still responsible for his choices now.
Especially now that he's been exposed to
other options, like, and things. Yeah.
Other options.
Right.
It's not just like, this is what I grew up with. This is my tight-knit community where we're super sheltered and we don't leave this.
But to put my sympathy hat on, you know, I think looking beneath, because you can look at it and go clearly, like, he was grasping for power, and all that is 100% true. That is 100% true in that conversation. And it's not good. But I also see a fear in him where he's seeing a black and white system that, let's be honest, is benefiting him. But he's seeing this system of patriarchal traditionalism, I would say, even more than fundamentalism. This kind of Andrew Tate style, which is not too different than normal evangelical views on manhood and womanhood. He was seeing that getting stripped away. And I think there was a real fear there of like, well, this is unknown territory. Like, I'm not even prepared for a marriage where I don't have a wife cooking all my meals and doing all these things. Like, and you see him fighting for that black and white. And on the other side, you have Olivia fighting for something beyond the black and white binary. And it's where I say it's the immovable object and the unstoppable force just colliding with each other, to where it's like, we're not, and this is where I go back into the deconstruction thing, is like, it's not that they have different perspectives. It's that the way that they receive, process, and apply information is drastically different. And that, I think, is the reason why a relationship either works or doesn't, is not, do we constantly agree on every single aspect of life, and are we religiously aligned and all of that stuff? Because like, uniformity is one thing. I'm talking about, do we even like research and learn the same way? And if the answer is no, like, there's a pretty clear expiration date on that relationship. And I think anybody watching the last season of the show, especially, or the last two, kind of saw the writing on the wall way early on, especially those of us who know people who've gone through that journey before. And it's a really sad thing, because obviously there's a lot of pain involved in that, and it's a really heartbreaking conversation. But on the flip side too, it's inevitable. And I think ultimately it's going to be a lot better for Olivia. And I'm hoping that over time, you know, Ethan arrives in a similar place in terms of, you know, being willing to look outside the rigid kind of confines of the box he was raised in. But, you know, I'm not.
But that box is protecting him.
Yeah, it's comfortable for him. And if I can say one more thing, and sorry, I feel like I'm going on rants, but these are all things that hit deeply for me. You know, one of the things with him that I hope he realizes, like, if I could sit across from Ethan in a diner and talk about this, is patriarchy on paper benefits men. And I think in some ways it does. If you're looking at, oh, now I have someone making all my meals and doing this whenever I want, and blah, you know, fill in the blank. But the reality is patriarchy robs men of a lot more than it gives them. And what I mean by that is, some of the best conversations I've had on this planet have been with my wife, sharing her perspective as an equal human being, and hearing her perspective and the way she perceived things as a parent and as a partner and as a human being have been really impactful. And I think if I was adhering to a system that on paper benefits me, if it silences that perspective, that does far more harm and sets me back far more than having a wife who's equal to me. And so I think one of the things I just hope people like Ethan realize, or men within these systems realize, is that patriarchy is not serving you. It might be giving you maybe more sex or more meals, but you're not going to be having sex that could be as amazing as it possibly would be. You're not having conversation and connection on a level that you would be outside of that system. Like you are limiting and restricting so many incredible things you can experience with your partner when you take a role of just dictatorial leadership, heavy on the dick, and that dictatorial leadership where you're just stomping over your spouse.
But then you get your way in every argument.
Yeah, you're basically just like, I want everything. I want you to be a kid that I am lording over. And that's not a healthy relationship, and it's not benefiting you. It might feel better on paper, but when you really dig into it, it's a much less satisfying position to be in.
Yeah, but then he'd have to learn to cook. But like, I mean, he might enjoy that. I like cooking.
Bro,
Cooking's fun.
DoorDash. Come on.
Yeah. I mean, that's expensive though.
It's okay. But man up. Mean, go make some more money. Get out there, get Alpha Brain, get Red Pilled, go work, go drop ship some stuff from Alibaba. Like, make it happen. You know?
Yeah.
Go out there, get 5 computer screens, and you start day trading.
Get a big computer, start mining some bitcoins. What's the other scam that the manosphere? I mean,
OnlyFans management is my favorite new one.
Exploitation of sex workers.
You are a creator who is making money. You need me to step in for some reason to be the middleman between you and that money. Anyway, sorry. I could go down many trails. See,
I've watched many Andrew Tate videos for this podcast, and I did not enjoy any of them. They're all just like,
it's because you're still in the Matrix.
I'm still in the Matrix. I need to take whatever pill he wants to. The pill that Andrew Tate's giving me is like, it's like a gas station pill.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry,
which is about as reliable as the gas station sushi. But
yeah, I mean, it depends on the gas station. If it's from a Sheetz, if it's from a Wawa.
Hey, you know what? Anyway, whatever. I'm not going to go down a rabbit hole, but I love 7-Eleven's food. I'm not going to lie. It's pretty good.
Okay. We have Wawa out here.
I don't know what that is.
Wawa. Oh man, it's in like the Northeast. They have like up in Pennsylvania. It's like a gas station with a deli.
It just sounds like what babies call water, but
yeah,
Wawa.
Yeah, like they have like an app you can order sandwiches. They're like decent deli sandwiches. Like they're better than Subway.
Maybe I have had that. Are they in South? I don't know. Maybe in South Carolina.
I don't know where they have them.
I don't know.
They might. I know they have them somewhere in Florida
like that. But out in those parts of the world, that is gas stations are a different breed. You know what I'm saying?
I want to thank you for coming on, Eric.
Oh, we're ending on that note. Okay.
Really? Yeah. I like gas stations.
We all do.
One time I was at a Sheetz in Ohio, and they had Mountain Dew seltzer.
Hell yeah,
Mountain Dew hard seltzer.
That stuff is so good. I just had that the other day.
Oh no, I thought it was awful.
Oh, okay.
I couldn't stand it because it was sugar free.
Oh, dude, that's the best part.
No, dude, it tasted so bad.
Have you? Which one did you do? The regular Mountain Dew, the Baja Blast. Which one did you do?
I got a variety pack,
and they're all good.
They're all bad.
Okay,
they're all. Awful.
I disagree. We should have ended a second ago. Let's end with gas stations are great.
Eric, I want to say thank you for coming on. This was a really interesting talk we had. Once again, go if you don't know Eric's podcast, then what are you even doing? How are you even deconstructing?
I mean, they know. Let's be honest. What are we even doing? You're here for me. We know.
Preacher Boys podcast. Go listen to it. Go download. Go subscribe. Go join his Patreon. Go buy his merch. And go support all the work that he's doing to try and stop abuse happening in people's churches. Thank you so much for coming on. You've been a great guest.
Yeah, man, I appreciate it, and I want to say thank you for this show because I've become more and more of a regular listener. I don't listen to many podcasts at this point. Ironic because I have one, but I really enjoy the podcast, and I know you guys personally, but I think the show's fantastic, and it only gets better with every episode. So Big fan. And in reverse, everything he said, go buy their merch and download their show and join their Patreon. Join the Give It All tier. Get your name right on the show, you know?
Yeah. All right. I'll talk to you later.
All right,
man.
sounds good.
Thanks for coming on.
But old rolling river of time healed me in too many days. No regrets, no confusion. There'll be no pollution. I'm so thankful I've decided to change my ways. I'm so thankful I decided